Make way for Mr. Speaker.
I invite the member for shoe swap to lead the House in prayer or reflection.
For divine guidance, so that our words and deeds may bring all the people of this great province hope, prosperity, and a vision for the future. May the deliberations of this chamber be characterized by temperance, understanding, and reason, to the end that we may better serve those who have made the members of this House guardians of and trustees for all the citizens of British Columbia.
Introductions by members. Minister of Children and Family Development.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I rise today in this House to introduce Danny Charles. They are the recipient of Right to Play's 2019 Canadian Youth Hero Award. Danny is here with members of the Chianu Right to Play programme, Programme Officer Jamie Lee Wesley and Programme Manager Jake Wynn. Danny is a dedicated youth leader who's passionate about spending time with their community elders and supporting youth members. Congratulations to Danny. We are grateful and blessed to have you in our community. Will the House please join me in making them very welcome today?
Member for Victoria Beacon Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am very thrilled today to make my first introduction of classes visiting. Joining us for question period today are two classes of grade 5 students from Glen Lyon Norfolk Junior School in my constituency. Thank you.
Member for Richmond North Centre.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. It is my great pleasure to welcome the founder and chair of the Baigong International Buddhist Society in Richmond, as well as the members here. The founder and current chair is Diana Cole, and the three members are Yanhua Meng, Ching Fan, and Susa Hu. Established in 2007, Baigong is a recognized charitable and religious organization which promotes Buddhism, equality, and care for each other. I'm so proud of BC's diverse tapestry, which embraces all religions. And here in the gallery are my two constituency assistants, Tony and William. William came a couple of weeks ago to this chamber, and he was so excited to watch us in action in question period, and he has to come back again. And this is Tony's first time. And I hope, Tony, you'll be just as excited as your colleague, William, and come back all the time and watch us in action. Will the members all welcome my guests today? Thank you.
Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I too would like to welcome a school group that's visiting this chamber today, students from the Maria Montessori Academy, located in Oak Bay, Gordon Head. Joined by their teacher, Mr. Aaron Galatli. They are 20 students who are in grade 10. Would the House please make them feel welcome?
Member for Kelowna West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It gives me a great honor today to welcome two people in the gallery that are here for the honor roll ceremony tonight. The first being Chris Foreman. Chris Foreman joined me just under 2 years ago as a CA. He'd moved from Coquitlam, where he had recently graduated from Royal Roads University. Who would have known when he joined me in March of 2020 that he would have been faced with COVID, whether it was orders, reopenings, or passports that the government had to go through. And needless to say, we've recently had the wildfire situation in Kelowna, and Chris has been on the front lines with that. But more importantly, Chris is a baseball fan and a successful little leaguer who played in Coquitlam and is looking forward to the World Series. Secondly, my granddaughter, the oldest of 5 grandchildren in our family, Ruby Annalena Dobner, is here joining us. She's in grade 6 from Constable Neil Bruce, and it was when I first got elected in 2009. Ruby was born on November 11th, 2009. And Ruby loves to cycle as well as ski, so welcome to both of them here in the gallery today.
Madam Clerk.
Introduction of bills. Statements by members.
Member for Kelowna West.
Oh, thank you. I was just getting primed up, Mr. Speaker. Since 2004, Westbank First Nation has thoughtfully and effectively managed their community forest. What started as a 5-year arrangement under the Community Forest Pilot Agreement has grown to a 25-year renewable community forest agreement license. Their work on the land is a balance of forestry management and harvesting, along with maintaining the forest for traditional uses including hunting, trapping, food gathering, and spiritual use. Split into 2 parcels, they manage more than 46,000 hectares of forest in the Kelowna area and have set a great example of what community forests can look like. But it's not just me that thinks this, Mr. Speaker. In fact, this year, Westbank First Nation was awarded the Robin Hood Memorial Award, which recognizes excellence in community forests around the province of the 50 that are in existence. Specifically, This is meant to honor community forests who have been exemplary in their progressive forestry practices, environmental stewardship, community benefits, and employment. However, this year, Westbank First Nation was especially recognized for its leadership in wildfire risk reduction, which included taking the lead on developing and planning a community forest wildfire risk management strategy, part of which comprised of a 10-kilometer buffer zone. One of 2 community forests selected to win this award this year out of more than 50 community forests in BC. They also received a $10,000 grant to continue their work and further invest in their forests. It's a huge honor for Dave Gill, the Westbank First Nation Community Forest Manager, Chief Chris Derrickson, his council, and for everyone involved in the management of the forest are incredibly proud and grateful for this recognition. I hope everyone in this House will join me in recognizing the work of Westbank First Nation on this project and congratulating them on a well-deserved honor.
Member for Chilliwack-Kent.
Mr. Speaker, did you know the Academy Award-winning song Up Where We Belong, made famous by Joe Cocker and Jennifer Warnes, was actually co-written by Cree superstar Buffy St. Marie? I mention this not only because she is still singing and working to improve the lives of Indigenous people at the majestic age of 80, but she recently made a short video to highlight Indigenous Disability Awareness Month and the work of the British Columbia Aboriginal Network on Disabilities Society, known as BCANS. She's a hard act to follow, but I rise today to proclaim November as Indigenous Disability Awareness Month in BC. This Awareness Month was created by BCANS in 2015 and is now recognized by hundreds of Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and organizations across Canada, including the BC Assembly on First Nations, the First Nations Summit, Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and Métis Nation, British Columbia. With what is believed to be the only Indigenous-specific disability awareness observance in the world, BC is leading the way in recognizing, raising awareness, and celebrating the contributions of Indigenous people with disabilities. In light of the tragic recoveries at the Kamloops Residential School and elsewhere, it's also important to acknowledge the role intergenerational trauma and poverty plays in disability and how this contributes to higher rates of disability among Indigenous peoples. We must continue on the path of reconciliation this month and every month as we take action to ensure equity rights, access, and opportunities for Indigenous peoples living with disabilities. I would like to thank BCANS for their ongoing leadership and support in this area. Recently, BCANS shared their expertise with government as we created the Accessible British Columbia Act, and we look forward to continuing to learn from them. I won't sing, but I'd like to leave you with a few lines from the song, Up Where We Belong. The road is long, there are mountains in our way, but we climb a step every day. Let's climb together and continue to remove barriers that prevent Indigenous peoples with disabilities from being included fully in our communities. Thank you.
Member for Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Speaker. I've spoken loud and proud before about a world-class class Nordic ski facility in Prince George, the Caledonia Nordic Ski Club. Over the years, the club's membership has included former Olympians such as Megan Tandy, who was a member of the 2014 and 2018 Canada Olympic team, Sarah Beaudry, a member of the 2018 Canada Olympic team, as well as World Championship competitors like Emily Dixon. Over the past few years, the ski club has upgraded trails and installed snowmaking equipment to ensure world-class conditions exist no matter what the weather. Caledonia Nordic have 55 kilometres of groomed trail, including several kilometres that have lighting, extending ski opportunities into the evening hours. One of my favourite ski events is Nordic skiing, is the Biathlon. Endurance skiing over challenging trails with intervals of precision shooting at small dollar-sized targets. The Caledonia Nordic Ski Club has hosted World Championship events in the past and had the privilege of hosting the Nordic events for the Canada Winter Games in 2015. It's about to host another. The Canadian National Biathlon Championship will be held in Prince George from March 13th to the 17th, 2022. This event will attract 250 of Canada's best biathlon athletes, along with their coaches, support teams, and families. Prince George will once again deliver our world-class hospitality as we have in past events. Volunteers were ready to sign up as soon as the event was announced at the end of September. Biathlon Canada has recognized the Caledonia Nordic facility as one of the best in Canada, and I wish to thank them for choosing this Prince George Jewel for this event. I also want to thank the generous community donors who have contributed so much to making our facility what it is today, and the club members and volunteers who generously give their time and energy in making this club so successful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Surrey Panorama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Diwali, the Festival of Lights, is being celebrated this week in India and around the world. Diwali celebrates the victory of light over darkness, good over evil, and knowledge over ignorance, and hope over despair. Unlike last year, friends and families will be gathering for this very special occasion. Homes are decorated with diyas and lights, new clothes, fireworks. This is a festival filled with joy, family, friends. They gather to share great food and exchange gifts. Diwali is an opportunity for all of us to reflect on the past year, to look forward and to plan for the future with renewed optimism. As we reflect on this past year, filled with uncertainty and challenges at every turn, we need to consider what we have learned. We have missed out on so much and have been impatient with the ever-changing new normal. Diwali is a time to reflect on what life in a pandemic has shown us. This past year has shown us the importance of being kind, patient, and grateful. It has reminded us of the significance of family, of friends, of community, and taught us to appreciate the smaller things and to look out for each other. Diwali celebrates the light within each of us. As we look forward, we need to remember to focus on the good within each of us and to open our hearts and our minds towards a better understanding of each other. We need to raise each other up. As we plan for the future, let us listen more, judge less, and learn from each other. Alongside Diwali, we celebrate Bandi Chhor Divas, a Sikh holiday when Guru Har Gobind Singh led 52 prisoners out of captivity and returned to Amritsar. I wish those celebrating in Surrey Panorama, British Columbia, and around the globe a very happy Diwali, happy Deepavali, and happy Bandi Chhor Divas. Sab nu lakh lakh vadaiyan.
Member for Caribou-Chilcotin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I have the privilege of speaking about the incredible Wilbur Saunders. It is a rare occasion to find someone who will give the kind of time to enhance the community that Wilbur contributes. He's been acknowledged as a Rotary Daybreak Honorary Parade Marshal and has been recognized as a community hero. His almost daily commitment to making our community a better place is incredible, and it does not go unnoticed, Mr. Speaker. Wilbur has for years in his retirement picked up garbage throughout our community. Very often he will share pictures of his accomplishments on Facebook, highlighting his thousands of steps taken during the course of his day, along with scenic pictures and beautiful photos of local wildlife in our parks, and of course, pictures of the bags upon bags of trash that he has collected. He will often show images of the type of trash he has had to collect and pick up, Mr. Speaker. He'll show images of recyclables, fast food wrappers, and cups. And of course, the most recent addition to his picking is face masks. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, I have rarely seen Wilbur post that he has picked up less than a few big bags of garbage in a day. He sadly never is short on work, but he does it willingly. And Mr. Speaker, he doesn't just pick up garbage once in a while, but rather multiple days per week. Fortunately for all of us in the Caribou-Chilcotin, we have Wilbur as a community member. Mr. Speaker, Wilbur asks for nothing in return. Well, that's not true. He asks that you don't litter. But other than that, he does this incredible volunteer work out of the goodness of his heart and commitment to improving our community, and for no other reason. From all of us in Caribou-Chilcotin, and of course from all of us at the BC Legislature, thank you very much, Wilbur Saunders.
Member for Nelson Creston.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Today, I'm going to read you a love letter. Before anyone gets too excited, this is not a romantic letter, but it is about love. Dear, you know who you are. I love you. You're incredibly strong, kind, loving, smart, and resilient. You deserve to thrive. You deserve to live up to all of the incredible potential that you have. You deserve to be happy and safe. What you have gone through has been tremendously difficult. The fact that you get up every day and function in society is a testament to your perseverance. What I want you to know is that you are not alone. And I mean this in two ways. You are not alone as you have a community and family that loves you. You are also not alone in the fact that many people, way too many people, have also suffered physical, emotional, and psychological abuse from their partner. These are strong, powerful, smart, kind people just like you. You are not alone, and you do not deserve this. No one does. It can happen to anyone, but disproportionately, women, Indigenous, racialized, transgendered, and gender diverse people are targeted. This does not define you. You determine what defines you. This is not on you, this is on them, the people who commit violence against their partners. Your home should be a safe space. Abuse is not love. Love is a verb, and it's about actions. As I end this love letter, I just want to restate that you are loved, you are worthy, you deserve better, and we are here for you, and we want better for you. Love, Brittany. If you find yourself in an unsafe situation, please reach out. Your MLA office is a safe space to start. We can point you to confidential services in your community that can help protect you. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Madam Clerk.
Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Jen Biddlecombe is the parent of an autistic child who watched the Minister of Children and Family Development in question period yesterday. She says, and I quote, "The Minister did not respond to any of the questions. No straight answers on how anything will work. My concerns were not addressed. In fact, I was angry at her response." End quote. Can the Minister tell Jen and thousands of other parents across the entire province why she has decided to claw back essential funds for parents who want to support their autistic children?
Minister of Children and Family Development.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Thank you to the member for the question. I do understand that there are many concerns out there in community, and I'm really want to hear from families, and we now have opportunity to be listening to families and listening to stakeholders, not only families with children with autism, but also all those other families that have been shut out of a system for far too long. Mr. Speaker, what I can reassure families is that there will be services available, rather than having to wait 2 years for a diagnosis and then have to scramble and build a patchwork of services for their child. Parents in the future will be able to bring their child into a hub, connect with a professional, and work with a multidisciplinary team and build a system of services around their child and youth.
Leader of the Official Opposition, supplemental.
Well, what the Minister conveniently leaves out of her answer is the fact that this is nothing more than a clawback. There are parents in British Columbia who have worked tirelessly to ensure that their children have the services they need today and in the future. It is a clawback of existing funding. The Minister stood in the House yesterday and repeatedly said that it's important to listen to parents. Well, I can assure you that we know this minister's inbox is overflowing with feedback from parents who are upset, who are anxious, and in fact, as we heard earlier, who are angry. She's received more feedback in the last week than in all the time that she was discussing this decision, where? Behind closed doors. So let's have a listen to what else Jen had to say. And I quote, "I am all for families getting the care they need, but it shouldn't come at the cost to others. The minister did not answer whether support systems that are already in place will be able to continue. In fact, families don't want what they have in place currently to end, end quote. Will the minister reverse her decision to claw back essential funding from parents all across British Columbia who simply want to continue to provide for the care of their autistic children?
Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And nothing immediately is happening in terms of autism funding, and I can reassure members of this House that our ministry has been making investments every single year in my ministry, including in respite, a budget lift of $13 million this year, and a $10 million investment, the first time in 20 years, in really vital equipment. So I will be listening to families, and I will not be listening to the other side of the House, who brought in $4 billion in cuts
Members.
and cut $15 million from children and youth with support needs.
Member for West Vancouver Capilano.
Mr. Speaker, parents and advocates that listened to the minister yesterday in question period were mystified by her suggestion that the right time to consult is after a decision and announcement has already been made. Quote, and I'm quoting Autism BC, I think that's very important for you all to understand. Quote, we, Autism BC, deny that MCFD had consulted us in their decision to terminate autism funding. We met with the minister for the first time for 30 minutes on October 15th to highlight our concerns and the lack of consultation from the 6,000 plus members of the autism community. They disregarded our requests, end quote. That was Autism BC. Can the minister tell us why she would claw back individual autism funding instead of increasing overall support?
Minister of Children and Family Development.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. We have been increasing support. Children and youth are very important to us. Our budget has increased year on year since 2017. The other side, when they were in power in 2001, cut $34 million from child and youth mental health supports and $185 million from child protection.
Member for West Vancouver Capilano, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister may want to look at some of the Twitter comments about the great work that the BC Liberal Party did in their time supporting increases in the autism community. But this is the same minister who rejected the recommendations of the representative for children and families, children and youth, to extend pandemic funding that was cut last September. So it is a little hard.
Members.
It's a little hard for parents to take the minister at her word. The minister is wrapping herself in the idea of improved services while doing the exact opposite and clawing back support. Ashley Gordon has this to say, quote, this is doing our children and families an injustice. Clearly, the decision was made by people who have no idea what it's like to live with autism and how difficult it's going to make it for families who struggle to even get out of the house, end quote. Will the minister stop this injustice, Mr. Speaker, and stop clawing back funding from Ashley's family?
Minister of Children and Family Development.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I can reassure the member and families in British Columbia that services will continue to be provided to families where their children have been diagnosed with autism. And in addition to that, the other families that I hear from, Honourable Speaker, with children with brain injury, with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, with other developmental delays, they will also get services. They have not been receiving services until now. We're going to build a public system so that there's a safety net of supports for all children and youth with support needs, including children with autism.
Member for Saanich North and Allowance.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. BC has the highest rent in the country. In fact, a report published in October found that BC had the highest quarter-over-quarter change in average rent. Rent increased 7.2% over the last quarter. The results are in the listings. In Vancouver, in October, the average price of a one-bedroom apartment was $2,155 per month. These numbers impact people. People are spending so much on rent that they're unable to save up or pay off student debt. They can't find housing near work or their families. The constant worry is having negative health effects. Researchers call this housing affordability stress, and it's exacerbating mental health challenges. All of this is because rent is out of control. Through you, Honourable Speaker, to the Attorney General and Minister of Housing, does the Minister realize just how difficult it is for millions of British Columbians to pay rent?
Attorney General and Minister of Housing.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question and for his spotlight on housing. I think housing is one of the most important issues in the province, and the shortage of rental housing is one of the most profound challenges we face. We're making some traction on getting new rental housing built. We have an issue where our population is increasing far more dramatically than our rental housing supply is. In that situation, rents are going up, and there's huge pressure placed on tenants that are in lower rent housing as landlords want to evict them and bring in folks that can pay more. And so what we need to do is build housing, and rental housing in particular, at a very large scale. We have $2 billion going into the housing hub to build rental housing. And this is just the start as we work with municipalities to streamline approvals. We've got 11,068 new rental housing units registered already in 2021. When you look at the previous government, not even close, Honourable Speaker. We have more purpose-built rental units registered for construction by June in 2021 than the old government ever registered in an entire year, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Saanich North and Island, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister is correct. There's been a number of actions that have been taken over the last 3 years. The problem is that over that time, the affordable rentals are out of reach. They don't exist because the rental market is out of control, Mr. Speaker. And the programs that the Minister referenced are all programs that are going to fix a problem in the future. The problem exists now for British Columbians. It's all over social media, people talking about their stories and the lack of affordability in their housing. The extreme challenges that our cities and towns are facing are challenges that are being faced now. So through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, these efforts that the government's outlined have not gone far enough. People need support now. What is the Minister doing now to make rental housing more affordable?
Attorney General.
Well, thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. One of the great challenges of the housing problem that we were left with is that there's a real lag between government programs starting and the delivery of that housing. The member is absolutely right. So that's why we put a number of...
Members?
I've already outlined, Honourable Speaker, how much better we're doing on rental housing starts the previous government. I think they should be a bit cautious, the opposition, about jeering. So with respect to what we're doing right now...
Let's listen to the answer, please. Attorney General. Yeah, that's fine, member. That's okay.
So far this year... I hear the opposition. So far this year, over 11,000 purpose-built rental homes registered in BC. That's 5 times the yearly average when the opposition is in power. Just to get in reality. Plus 2% rent increases of the old government. We put a ban on rent increases during COVID. We have limited rent increases to inflation only. We have increased the availability of the safer subsidy for seniors so that they're able to stay in their housing. We've increased money available for seniors to retrofit housing so they can stay in their housing longer. We have increased resources to the residential tenancy branch, with the enforcement branch, by the way, that the previous government put in but never funded to support tenants and landlords. We've got a lot more work to do. The pressure is continuing, and we will
Members.
continue that work, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Abbotsford West.
Thanks, Honourable Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Forest. I understand the Minister and the government are poised to make an announcement that will have profoundly negative consequences for people who derive a living from working in BC's forests. As the details emerge, experts and stakeholders are already sounding the alarm bells. The imposition of these land use decisions, we are told, will result in the closure of upwards of 12 mills right across British Columbia, an overall reduction in the AAC of between 15 and 20%, and the loss of somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 jobs. My question to the Minister is, has the government completed a detailed socio-economic study on the impact these land use decisions are going to have for British Columbia's forest-dependent communities, forest-dependent families? Will she release it now so that people will know how many mills are going to close and how many thousands of British Columbians are going to lose their jobs?
Minister of Forest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank the member for the question and thank, thank him for his interest in forestry now, something that they didn't have when they were in yeah. So we have a new vision for forests. We have a new vision for forests in this province, one where our oldest and ancient forests are protected, one where Indigenous peoples are full partners in sustainable management of the forests, and one where workers and communities benefit from a sustainable, innovative forestry that will have jobs for generations to come. And we are online to make sure that we are meeting the commitments of the recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Review. And of course, we are doing economic analysis. But for now, we were going to be announcing our process for deferrals. We also will be announcing how we are going to move forward in working in collaboration and cooperation with Indigenous nations, because that was the #1 recommendation from the Strategic Review. I think it would be highly inappropriate to put people at risk to say that we're going to defer and not have socioeconomic analysis done, but also not have the supports in place for communities, for workers, to make something that the previous government never did when over 30,000 people lost their jobs in this forest industry in this province.
Member for Abbotsford West, supplemental.
Thanks, Honourable Chair. Well, we'll come to the issue of First Nations involvement and their response here just in a few moments, because it is emblematic of the response the Minister is getting from virtually every quarter on this. Look, she apparently is not going to release a socioeconomic report, and the reason she's not going to, because her own ministry has confirmed they haven't done one. That's right. They haven't completed one. She is... The Minister is about to, and I think a moment ago just did confirm, that she and the government are about to defer and suspend existing cutting permits without compensation. Mm-hmm. They are apparently going to cancel the very BC forest-dependent families won't be smiling at the end of the day. I can guarantee you that, Mr. Speaker.
Really funny.
They are poised to cancel the very BC timber sale licenses that the value-added sector rely on for their survival, Mr. Speaker. And they are embarking upon all of this in the absence of a detailed socio-economic report that will confirm not just where those mills are going to close, but the impact that is going to be felt by thousands of forest-dependent families. Will the minister confirm that the reason she's not releasing a detailed socio-economic report is because she doesn't have one?
Minister of Forests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, I'm really happy to have this discussion with this member, and I'll be making further announcements this afternoon, and I will be more than happy to show the opposite side of the House how it is we support workers in this province, how it is we support communities in this province, but also how it is we actually have a vision for a forest industry that not only is sustainable and is going to be here for generations to come. We are supportive of forests that also are not only here for harvesting, they are here for clean water, clean air, and to ensure that they're providing all of the biodiversity they need to provide. We have a vision for forests in this province, and we are going to be sharing it, and I'll be happy to discuss it with the member opposite.
Member for Abbotsford West, second supplemental.
Thanks, Honourable Chair. You know what part of that strategy involves that the minister seems so proud to tout at this point in the House? It's to bridge people to retirement.
That's the plan.
Bridging people to retirement. That is hardly a strategy.
We know what it says.
That is hardly a strategy for long-term economic stability. You know, is there a worse time in the history of this province to layer on uncertainty for families and British Columbians? We've come through this incredibly difficult time, and the minister and the government choose this moment to make land use decisions that we know are going to put thousands upon thousands of people out of work. I'll ask one more time. Will the minister release the detailed socioeconomic report? If she won't, will she confirm that she's not prepared to because one simply hasn't been done?
Minister.
I look forward to releasing all the information this afternoon, and I'll be only too happy to discuss it with the members opposite.
Member for Nechako Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, what I find interesting is we just heard earlier today on autism funding how the government says one thing about consultation and yet does another. And we just heard now from the Minister of Forests how Indigenous people are full partners. And I want to actually quote the Premier from back in June, where the Premier said this around forest management, and I quote, "The first step must be respecting Indigenous land management rights in their territory." End of quote. Well, the BC First Nation Council has already issued a press release regarding the minister's announcement coming this afternoon, saying the NDP has done just the opposite. NDP, no delivered promises. Chief Bill Williams put it simply, and I quote, "The honour of the Crown cannot be met through fundamentally flawed consultation," end quote. So, through you to the Minister, why have First Nations been left out of the decisions that will impact them directly?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question because he's right. We are very passionate about the collaboration, government-to-government discussions with Indigenous nations, and also ensuring that it is with the rights and title holders. I respect and really appreciate the work done by the First Nations Forestry Council, and the work that we are doing and continuing to do have been with the rights and title holders, and we will continue to do that.
Member for Nichaco Lake, supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. And I find that comment quite interesting. And I want to quote Clay Tyndall, who is the General Manager of Forest Operations for the Lillooet Nation, who suggests who says any suggestion that the province has involved First Nations in forest decisions are absurd. And I quote, "The Lillooet First Nation just spent several $1 million to purchase a forest license in their territory so that they could have a bigger say in decisions regarding forest management in their territory. And now the government comes along and is trying to tell the nation what they can and cannot do." End quote. That's a quote directly from the press release from the First Nation Forest Council. First Nations have repeatedly offered to work collaboratively with this government. This government has stood up and touted working with First Nations. But the NDP have, according to the First Nations Forest Council, have, and I quote, "chosen to do their own thing," end quote. Can the minister explain why she has chosen to do her own thing instead of working with First Nations?
Minister of Forests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will reiterate, our government is committed to government discussions with Indigenous nations, rights and title holders. We are doing that and we will continue to do that.
Official Opposition House Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. None of the minister's answers actually stand up today to any scrutiny whatsoever. We've heard about reports from industry and concerns of industry of what will happen and the lack of socioeconomic reviews and planning by this government on what their decisions will actually mean to those workers in those communities. We've heard about a lack of consultation and First Nations themselves saying this. This is not us inventing quotes. This is from a press release that gets released right out before the minister's announcement from the First Nations Forestry Council. So here's the facts from one of the industry reports. That's a current and recent report. 4 of the mills and a third of the shake and shingle industry will close on the coast, Mr. Speaker. And I know the members from Surrey on the other side seem to think this was a laughing matter. Shortly, they might want to talk to their shake and shingle mills in Surrey about this. 5 mills and 2 veneer plants in the interior will close. And the pulp and paper mills will close and be on severe curtailments throughout the province. This is going to lead to at least 12 mills closing across BC. Again, where is the minister's analysis and plans to help communities and impacted workers from the decisions that this government is embarking on?
Minister of Forests.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the member, but I think it's highly inappropriate to speculate on deferrals that haven't been made yet, to speculate on mills that are going to be closed if we haven't even had those government-to-government discussions concluded with Indigenous nations on whose traditional territory those mills are. We have been doing the work. Members. Industry knows, workers know, communities knows, and Indigenous nations certainly know that we have been doing the work after we received the report from the Old Growth Strategic Review. We have brought together a technical advisory panel looking at the different areas of the province, looking at those rare, iconic, those ancient old growth trees that are at risk to irreversible loss. We're looking at how we're going to manage our forest industry so that it's managed in a sustainable way that is here for generations to come. And we will continue to do that because that's what's right for the province, that's what's right for workers, for communities, and that's what's right for our forests.
Opposition House Leader, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, these are very serious concerns from industry, from Indigenous leadership and Indigenous communities, and the businesses that are impacted by the work that they do in the forest industry. And the minister to date, so far today, has not been able to provide any assurance whatsoever or actual verification that they have actually done proper socioeconomic modeling on what will happen
with decisions that will be made and announced this afternoon. There are over 10,000 businesses that work in forestry. This includes 30,000 indirect jobs like equipment sales, machinery repair, and environmental consulting. There's also extra jobs like in diners, cafes, grocery stores that rely on forestry workers to shop there. All of that needs to be looked at, but it hasn't been by this government. And this minister refuses to acknowledge that they avoided that. So again, why on earth won't the NDP share a study on what the impacts of today's announcement will be, or have they not done a study at all?
How many mills are going to close?
Minister of Forests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, the member's fear-mongering. He's speculating on an announcement that hasn't...
Members, let's listen to the answer, please. Order. Members, let's listen to the answer. Minister will continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'm from a forest industry. I understand the forest industry. I understand the repercussions of what happens in forest industries when there's downturns, when mills are closed. I understand what happens because I lived through it. I lived through 30,000 people in this province losing jobs. I lived through 30,000 people losing jobs without any supports from the government
Members.
that sat here, that are now the opposition across the way.
Members, question had already been asked. Now the time for answer. Please.
Unlike members opposite, we are ensuring there are going to be supports in place. We are ensuring that if there are going to be any repercussions, that there will be supports in place. And I will be announcing those this afternoon. And I will make sure that the members opposite get a full briefing on what we're announcing, a full briefing on the supports we are now announcing, a full briefing on how we are moving forward with a vision for forestry in this province, a vision that none of them ever came forward with, a vision... Our vision includes that we protect the most ancient, the most rare old growth in this province. Our vision is about Indigenous people who have a full voice in the management of the forest on their traditional territory. And our vision is about securing work for workers, for communities that will benefit from a secure, sustainable forest industry that will be here for generations to come.
The bell ends the question period. Honourable members, I have the honour of tabling the Auditor General's report on Fraud Risk Management Survey Report 2020-21 and British Columbia Human Rights Commission's report Building a Culture of Human Rights. Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have two reports to table. I respectfully present the approved guarantees and indemnities report for the fiscal year ended March 31st, 2021 in accordance with the Financial Administration Act, Section 72(8). And pursuant to the Financial Administration Act, I am pleased to present reports for the fiscal year ended March 31st, 2021 on all amounts borrowed by government and all amounts loaned to government bodies. These reports provide an overview of the province's borrowing activity in fiscal 2021.
Madam Clerk.
Orders of the day.
Government House Leader.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I call second reading Bill 27.
Attorney General.
That's it, man.
Bill, that was
Attorney General.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I move that the bill be now read a second time. The bill implements the recommendations from the report of the All-Party Special Committee to review provisions of the Election Act on annual allowances paid to political parties. The bill makes annual allowances permanent and establishes how they are to be calculated. For 2022 and 2023, eligible political parties will receive $1.75 per vote received in the most recent general election. In 2024 and each following year, the per vote amount will be adjusted by the change in CPI for the previous year. The amendments also move the payment of dates of annual allowances to non-statutory holidays on the recommendation of Elections BC. Annual allowances were introduced in 2017 when corporate and union donations were also banned and individual contribution limits reduced. To be eligible for annual allowances, a party must have received at least 2% of the total valid votes cast in all electoral districts in the most recent general election, or 5% of the total valid votes in districts where the party had candidates. Making the annual allowance permanent aligns BC with other jurisdictions in Canada, which have also provided annual allowances after making similar changes to campaign financing rules. I thank all members of the All-Party Committee for their work on this issue. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Abbotsford West, please.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. And on the second reading of Bill 27, first of all, I should acknowledge, as the Attorney General has just pointed out, that the bill before us is reflective of the recommendations presented by the All-Party Special Committee, and to that extent, I think is faithful to those recommendations. It is a short bill. I can advise the Attorney General that at committee stage, there are some technical matters that we may wish to explore briefly as it relates to the calculation methodology, and perhaps also the thinking, the government's thinking to eliminate the review mechanism that was incorporated into the first act. I think everyone is aware, and I think the Attorney General would acknowledge undertakings made at the time of introduction that this would not become a permanent feature of the electoral financing landscape in BC. This act, following in the footsteps of the All-Party Committee recommendation, chooses to do that. I suppose the question that flows, was it necessary, though, to eliminate an automatic mechanism by which the regime could be reviewed either every 3 years, every 5 years? That feature disappears along with the amendments in this act, to the act. Those are matters that we can explore at the committee stage of discussion for the bill, Mr. Speaker, and in keeping again with the recommendations, the government should anticipate support from the opposition at second reading to move the bill forward to committee.
Thank you. Seeing no further speakers. Surrey Panorama. And before Surrey Panorama, just members, recall if you're crossing to the other side, you're supposed to pay respect to the, not me, the chair. Thank you. Surrey Panorama, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise today and speak in support of this legislation. And what's significant is that this legislation is coming forward as a result of collaborative work being done by all parties in the House. And there was absolute consensus to bring forward this legislation on the financing of elections. I think this is a significant legislation because, number one, it keeps, along with other measures that our government has taken, big money out of the electoral process. And the other area where it really assists says not everyone who wants to run in an election has the financial whereabouts or the financial support from their specific community to run campaigns. So when you have money that is provided, democracy is able to proceed in a much more inclusive way. And we're not unique in this piece of legislation. Other provinces have taken these steps to make sure that there is a per capita or per vote subsidy that is provided to all parties who qualify. So once again, in order to make sure that everyone can participate in our democratic structures, it behooves this House to make sure that we make it possible, we enable that, and we reduce the barriers that stand in the way. But also, by providing these supports, we are also ensuring, along with the limits on how much can be donated, and making sure that businesses and unions cannot make direct contributions, we've also made sure that there is more of a level playing field for people who do want to run in elections. And we've made sure that that pressure that comes with people being able to donate large sums of money, as was in the past. There was a time we were known as the Wild Wild West when it came to election financing. And I'm pleased that this legislation has come forward to help to support getting that money out of the electoral process, but also ensuring that our democracy remains healthy and people are able to participate, because that participation is very, very important. The size of income or your savings or the size of your house should not determine who can run to be an MLA in British Columbia. Our democracy needs representation in this House from the full diversity, economic diversity, socio-economic diversity, to make sure that the voices of the people are really heard in the people's House. So once again, Mr. Speaker, I am delighted that this work was done, and I do want to thank committee members who worked on this from both sides of the House to make sure that an eye was kept on this. And one of the things that's very, very clear for me in this is that we wanted to make sure, or the committee did, and their recommendation was put into legislation, is that we did not fall behind with inflation. So, of course, these sums of monies will be adjusted with the cost of inflation, and that will make sure that the real monies that are being allocated are kept in demand. And, Mr. Speaker, I know that there are provinces like Ontario and Alberta and others and Quebec that already have annual allowances, and they've made similar changes to campaign financing rules. And the sum of monies, and I know the public who is listening will want to know, so the amendments will ensure that in 2023, those parties that are eligible will receive $1.75 per vote received in the most recent general election. That is going down from $2.50 when the allowance was first introduced. And this is a very fiscally responsible step being taken, and it is, as I said previously, one that all political parties and everybody who participated are in full agreement. And often the question is asked, well, how does this compare to other provinces? Because you know what? We all love comparisons. Well, the allowances in other provinces range anywhere from $1.60 per vote to $2.54. So I think that the sums being suggested here are very prudent. And along with that, as I said, cost of inflation will lead to adjustments. And, as I said earlier, that this system of an allowance was brought in, but it was temporary, and this makes it permanent on an ongoing basis. And it ensures that we have a very healthy and we have a democracy that is more inclusive, that is more inviting, and that removes some of the barriers that people might face. So, Mr. Speaker, I support this legislation. Thank you.
Minister of State for Infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Honourable Speaker. It is my great honour to be able to rise in support of Bill 27, the Election Amendment Act today. So for those who are watching, of which I know there are many people who watch the BC Legislature live from the comfort of their own homes, Bill 27 was created following the unanimous recommendation of the All-Party Special Committee to review provisions of the Election Act. And the All-Party Special Committee means that it is a committee that consists of people from all the different political parties represented in the House, including the BC NDP, the BC Liberals, the BC Greens as well. And it is, in particular, Bill 27 is an act to introduce a permanent per-vote allowance to political parties. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with how the per-vote allowance came to be, it was originally introduced in 2017 by our government when government moved to take big money out of politics. Big money meaning corporate and union donations, as well as large amounts of donations, sometimes tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of dollars from people who potentially didn't even reside in British Columbia. Now, Honourable Speaker, I wholeheartedly support keeping big money out of politics. I think that that move has been one of the most important changes to the way that our system of democracy functions here in British Columbia in the last many years. And that was done back in 2017, and I want to make sure that it stays that way. I feel that prior to the banning of big money in our politics, the presence of big money was a rot on our democracy. It degraded public trust in its politicians and government, and that's saying something because let's face it, politicians are not exactly seen by members of the public as the most trusted professions around the world, and so having a system in place that further degrades that trust is really, really problematic from the perspective of keeping faith in our democratic systems. And it caused citizens to question who their governments really worked for when their campaigns are potentially bought and paid for by special interests. When I ran in my first paid election campaign, and I say paid as in it involved a lot of money because I've run in student politics before and those campaigns generally didn't involve very much money at all. But my first major election campaign involving a lot of donations and a lot of spending was for the 2017 election. And when I learned about how much money it would take to successfully run an election campaign, how much resources I would need to acquire and raise, I did as most candidates did, and I set to work fundraising. And Honourable Speaker, I set to work, I started off seeking donations from family and friends, as one does. But before long, it became very apparent that I could not raise the staggering amounts of money required for a successful election campaign if I did not pursue even larger amounts of money from organizations and wealthier donors. And the pressure to seek out and accept these large donations and these large amounts was tremendous. Because even when you're running for the right reasons, and I would say in particular, if you're running for the right reasons, the stakes that you feel, or you recognize that the stakes around winning and losing are so tremendous because it has nothing to do with the success of yourself. It has everything to do with the success of your community, the well-being of the families around you, and the prosperity or the potential suffering of people across the province. And so the pressure to fundraise from those groups who could cut checks larger than a couple of $100 here or there was enormous. But with all of it came the ever-present weight of what might come tied to that money. Make you question whether or not this was something that was right, even if the outcomes that you were seeking were right. Said or unsaid, you wondered what they were expecting of you. Because not all donors donate in good faith, and I think we would be naive to think that. So when I became an MLA, after the election, there was an issue that was brought to my attention almost immediately. And the issue was later written about in the North Shore News by a reporter named Brent Richter, who headlined his piece, quote, "Sweetheart Port Tax Deal Questioned by North Vancouver," unquote. It was a story about a specific industrial port company in North Vancouver that was given what Richter had described as a, quote, "sweetheart deal," unquote, on its property taxes from the previous BC Liberal government, leaving other municipal taxpayers to pick up the tab. Now, according to the municipality, the company owed more than $1 million in back taxes and penalties at the time, and this was only a part of the very bizarre story and bizarre issue at hand. Former BC Liberal MLA Ralph Sultan was actually quoted in this article as someone who fought his own government on the deal that they had cut the company. I'm going to read to you what he said in the article. So I'm quoting from the article now. In an interview, Sultan said he has been very definitely on the side of the district in the dispute. He quotes, this is now a quote from him, "The forestry industry was struggling, and this was an attempt by the BC Liberal government to help the forestry industry with one of their channels of distribution. But of course, from the perspective of the North Shore, they were the ones who were being asked to ante up the subsidy, not the provincial government. They were offloading this wonderful gift to the real estate taxpayers of North Vancouver. I pointed that out to the minister and said that this is not going to sell very well. But I think the question is whether you, in fact, have the right to do this." This ends Mr. Sultan's quote. And the article further goes to read, Sultan said it was the ministry's position that it was within their rights. And I'm continuing to read from the article. Since 2005, FibreCo has donated $48,363 to the BC Liberal Party, its candidates or its leadership contestants, according to the Elections BC. In that same time, it gave $1,290 to the BC NDP. In Tokol, a company whose affiliate is FibreCo's majority shareholder, has donated more than $300,000 to the Liberal Party or its candidates since 2005. The terminal also hosted then Premier Christy Clark during the 2017 election for a campaign stop to talk about the importance of the forestry industry to BC's economy. Quote, Christy, quote, former Premier Clark, "The biggest forest-dependent town in British Columbia is Metro Vancouver," Clark told the gathered press. But even at the time of the campaign stop, FibreCo's leadership had already set in plan a motion to drastically scale back its wood export business in favor of grain exports. The company had filed applications with the Vancouver Fraser Port Authority and the District of North Vancouver to demolish the wood chip export infrastructure and build an $85 million grain terminal. Now, why would the North Shore News tie donation and election activities to the story about the back taxes? Surely a government wouldn't make decisions based on who their donors were, would they? Now, Dermot Travis, who was the former executive director of Integrity BC, who we said goodbye to in 2020 following a life dedicated to transparency and accountability, was quoted later on in the article, which might help answer this question. And it was on, let's see, let me flip to it now. So this was his quote. "Definitely, I think what radiates off of this particular case is the fact that something was going on behind closed doors, which suggested that a sweetheart deal was struck between the provincial government and a major corporation in British Columbia, also a major donor to the BC Liberal Party. And it's the District of North Vancouver that's getting stuck with the bill. That would demonstrate, quite frankly, that a lot more sunshine needs to be put on this to determine whether or not it's an isolated incident or whether there are similar incidents in other parts of the province as Metro Vancouver." Now, Honourable Speaker, the reality is I do not know if those donations had anything to do with the decisions that the BC Liberal government made of the day. Just like I do not know if big money had anything to do with the sale of BC Rail or the sweetheart deal at Little Mountain, or whether it's merely a coincidence that, according to Integrity BC, top BC Liberal donors at the time had received $15 billion in government handouts, and that half of all appointees to the various boards and of agencies and crown corporations were BC Liberal donors. I do not know, and I don't believe necessarily that anybody here can say for sure.
Minister,
but what I do
Minister,
know,
I think you've made your point. You
but
want to move back on to the
oh
bill,
yes,
please?
no,
Thank you.
absolutely. But I do know, however, that the fact that we even have to ask is an affront to our democracy. When the New York Times described what the New York Times described as the Wild West of Canadian political cash damaged the trust of British Columbians in their government, in their elected officials, in the entire parliamentary system. There should be no question in the mind of the British Columbia public that their elected officials are working for them because they are the ones who pay for them, not some oil and gas company in Alberta or numbered corporation registered in a different country altogether. And a person's ability to become a candidate and run a successful election campaign should not be dependent on their ability to cozy up to wealthy donors. Now, I want to take a moment here and apologize briefly to the members opposite, BC Liberal colleagues in this House, because I used a lot of examples that were from their time in government, simply because those were the examples that were familiar to me. But they were not intended to offend them. In fact, a lot of the members of the current opposition were not even around at the time that happened. But the point of the matter is the structure of our election campaigns and the framework within which we fund them opens up even well-meaning governments to questions like this that should never have to be asked. And so my understanding is that all members of this House will be supporting this bill because it's the right thing to do, and I'm glad to know that because I know that we're going to be doing the right thing together. Thank you, Honourable Speaker.
Member for Langley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to rise and speak to this bill, the Election Amendments Act. And I'd like to begin by thanking the members of the Special Committee for Reform and Amendment of the Election Act. I had the pleasure of participating as a member of the committee, and I'd like to, especially thank the chair of the committee, the member for Surrey Fleetwood, but also the deputy chair, the member for Kamloops North Thompson, as well as the member for Saanich North and the Islands. I think the work of the committee and the work the committee engaged in is, some of the best work that I've seen in this House in the past year in terms of looking at the bipartisan and kind of cross-partisan nature of consultations and just the work of the committee. And I think that's, really for the folks at home and the folks who may be listening to this, something to consider and to look at when you're looking at the work of this House, which is how much of it is done by committees and how much of it is done very effectively across party lines by committees. Now, I'd like to talk a bit, and the Minister of State for Transportation or the Minister of State for Infrastructure touched on this, but I'd like to talk a bit about the context and the ban on big money. And I'm not going to go, so much into particular examples, Mr. Speaker. Suffice to say that a dollar should not equal a vote. And that's something that I think is fairly uncontentious and something that's pretty broadly accepted in our democracy. Whether you're taking big money from unions or corporations, that should not determine how many people in the province of British Columbia you're allowed to speak to and reach as a candidate for office. Now, I ran twice for provincial office, and that's I ran first in 2013 and then again in 2020. So I ran under both regimes, and the difference is striking. And I can say that the perception of the public, of politicians, and of our democracy it varies greatly. The level of distrust folks have when they know that politicians are attending big money events behind closed doors with all types of, frankly, interest groups. It's not a good look. It doesn't smell right, and it's not something we ought to have in our democracy. However, to take that out of the equation and to put a cap on donation limits like we have, which was the right thing to do, Mr. Speaker, also leaves a hole in the financing of political parties. The stark reality of it is that there are fixed and rising costs to political campaigns in the modern environment, especially with what we're seeing in terms of an increasingly fractured media environment where it's more and more difficult to reach voters. And I'll give an example. Just this past election, I didn't engage, I think like most folks in this House, in door knocking, being in with the concerns around social distancing and the coronavirus. So we relied heavily on phone canvassing. Now, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, back when everybody had landline phones, and my parents had landline phones, and you could look at numbers in the phone book and correlate them to the election list. You can't do that anymore. Folks have cell phones, and cell phone data that's available to political parties and to candidates running for office to contact voters is very, very poor. And so what ends up happening is you start to look for other means to reach people, all of which have a dollar value. And the costs rise, and whether that's advertising on social media, leafleting, whether you're doing voice-automated phone calls, or advertising in the paper or television, all of that costs money. And that loss of ability to finance is particularly, I think, acutely felt by smaller political parties. So while it's absolutely the right thing to do to ban big money and take money out of politics, we need to make sure that we're also supporting our democracy and supporting political parties. And that's what this financing does and what the financing has done. And, I just want to say a bit, I'll talk a bit about the committee, but what we heard from the committee as well, from the academic experts that we spoke to, about the role of political parties in our democracy and in our province. Parties are a good thing. They help make government intelligible. They help organize election on lines of choice where folks know what they're voting for and they know what they're getting. I mean, you could look at today's political system in pretty stark contrast to the BC political system before Richard McBride, our great premier that introduced the party system to BC. But before that, you'd vote for your local candidate, and you'd have no idea who would be premier coming out of that. You'd have no idea who would be Attorney General or Minister of Finance, because it was sorted out by caucus behind closed doors. And you'd also have no idea what kind of policies, or frankly, who was funding them, that would come out of that process. So political parties play a very important brokerage function in our democracy and a very important function for transparency. And so I think making sure that they're well-resourced so that we can have competitive elections where folks have choices and where there's a variety of options and alternative parties is a positive thing. Now, that being said, smaller parties ought to be able to demonstrate a sufficient level of popular support to merit that, and that's how we set up the system. So, the committee was an all-party committee, like I said, and we did three broad days of consultation with invited experts and stakeholders that presented to us on a whole, we got a whole range of opinion there and kind of different takes, but all kind of landed broadly in the middle, which was there was very broad support for financing political parties and for the role political parties play in the process. But there was also very broad support for making the allowance permanent. And when you think about it, Mr. Speaker, that just makes good sense. I mean, what you don't want, and I'll, hearken back to the federal Harper Conservative government that removed financing for political parties and kept the donation limit in place. Who was punished by that? Smaller parties, right? Who ultimately loses from that is the voting public, who is less likely to hear of the opinions and the positions put forward in a political campaign by those smaller parties. So it makes perfect sense to keep it permanent, to keep it non-political, and to provide that level of certainty to political parties engaging in the electoral process. So, as part of the public consultation, the committee went out and asked 3 questions: whether the annual allowance to political parties should continue after 2022, and if so, the amount of the allowance and the number of years it should be paid. And it's noted in the report that was produced by the committee and tabled in this House that the recommendation was that the allowance should stay at 175 per vote, which is significantly lower than the allowance was when it was introduced in 2017, as well as to index it to CPI. So I think, Mr. Speaker, this is a pretty conservative policy in terms of funding political parties. So I would, as a member of the British Columbian public myself, I think that members of the public should be heartened that we've taken a fairly conservative approach with how to do this. I mean, we heard from the member from Surrey Panorama that the allowance ranges from about $1.60 in New Brunswick to $2.54 in Ontario, and we're right above the lower end of that. And making sure it's indexed to inflation, like I said, to make sure that we're keeping up with those continuing and rising costs. But most importantly, Mr. Speaker, I think are the eligibility requirements. And, to ensure that what this doesn't do and what we don't want is to create a cartel of bigger parties where smaller parties can't break through. And the eligibility requirements mean that you have to have 2% of the total valid votes cast in the previous general election, or 5% of the total votes where you've run candidates. And that is so important because there are 5 eligible political parties right now for this. The BC NDP, the BC Liberal Party, the Green Party, the Conservative Party, and the Rural Party. And what you're seeing there with the Conservative Party and the Rural Party are 2 small parties that are growing in British Columbia that primarily run candidates and represent rural areas. And, I think that's critically important that we make sure that those voices are heard. And so they're not penalized by this eligibility requirement, which is, I think, a benefit to all of us and a benefit to our democracy. So, I strongly support this bill, Mr. Speaker. I think this is a positive bill. I think it's relatively uncontentious, and I think it's for the betterment of our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you, member. I'd like to thank the Minister of Health and the member for Caribou-Chilcotin for taking their conversations outside. Much appreciated, so it doesn't disturb those people that are speaking in the House. Thank you. Surrey Fleetwood.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. I would like to join other members to say I'm very pleased to stand up in this House today to support the Election Amendment Act 2021, introduced in this House by our government last week. And the good thing is, Mr. Speaker, that we see some young people up in the gallery sitting there and looking at the future of this province as to where the political process is going moving forward. I also want to say, before I start making my comments, convey my sincere thanks to the committee members from all parties, from BC Liberal Party, from Green Party, and NDP Party, who were part of this special committee, and I had the rare honor to be the chair of that committee. I want to say thanks to them for their dedication, deep commitment, and unbiased approach to this very important public policy issue. So my sincere thanks to them. So, Mr. Speaker, it is important to note that an all-party special committee to review provisions of the Elections Finance Act was established in March 2021 to consider the following things. First, whether an annual allowance paid to political parties should be continued to be paid after 2022. Second, if an annual allowance to political party is to be continued, the amount of the annual allowance and the number of years the annual allowance is to be paid. Those were the key questions the committee was supposed to respond. That was the mandate of the committee. This all-party committee, Mr. Speaker, launched a public consultation process in April 2021, inviting British Columbians to provide a written, audio, or video submissions prior to May 28, 2021, focused on the above said questions. An advertisement was subsequently placed in major provincial and community newspapers, and the Legislative Assembly's social media account and the committee's website were also used to promote the consultation process. Mr. Speaker, the committee's 2021 spring public consultation process engaged academic experts, stakeholders, and individual British Columbians to review the annual allowance paid to political parties in the province. And the committee heard a total of 11 presentations and received 103 written submissions and 1 video submission, providing input whether the annual allowance to political parties should continue to be paid after 2020, and if so, the amount of the annual allowance and the number of years it is to be paid. The Chief Electoral Officer, Anton Bogman, and officials from the Election BC also appeared before the committee and provided a briefing on the statutory framework and administration of the annual allowance paid to political parties. A large majority of the written submissions and oral presentation, Mr. Speaker, by academic experts made the following 3 strong arguments in favor of the continuation of the annual allowance to political parties. First, this annual allowance levels the playing field for political parties and keeps the influence of big money out of politics. Second, that a modest vote allowance is a good investment in a strong and fair voting system. And third, by allowing increases with inflation, this system provides all parties with a predictable and dependable funding, so we can keep the big money out of politics. So, Mr. Speaker, as a result of this extensive public consultation process, the All-Party Special Committee made the following 3 recommendations to the Legislative Assembly of BC that, first, an annual allowance paid to political parties be continued to be paid after 2022. Second, the annual allowance paid to political parties be calculated as follows. In 2023, $75 per vote received in accordance with applicable section of the Election Act. And in 2024 and each following years, by adjusting the per vote amount by the change in the Consumer Price Index for the previous year. And third, the annual allowance paid to political parties be made permanent. So those were the 3 recommendations made by the Special Committee, Honorable Speaker, and that's why we are here today talking about this bill. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, at the unanimous recommendation of the All-Party Special Committee to review the provisions of the Election Act, proposed amendments to the Election Act will make the annual allowance for political parties permanent. In 2017, Mr. Speaker, government moved to take big money out of politics by banning unions and corporate donations. At that time, Mr. Speaker, annual allowance was introduced. It was to expire in 2022 to support political parties, and so that they can transition to the new election financing systems. The amendment, if passed, Mr. Speaker, ensures that in 2023, eligible political parties will receive $1.75 per vote received. In the most recent election, down from $2.50 when the allowance was introduced first. So making the annual allowance, Mr. Speaker, permanent aligns BC with other jurisdictions in Canada, including Quebec and Ontario. We have also provided an annual allowance after making similar changes to campaign financing rules. Both Ontario and Quebec has done that too. The committee, Mr. Speaker, received information from Election BC officials and public hearing presentation on annual allowance for political parties in other jurisdictions. So annual allowances range from, as I said earlier by members, from $1.60 per vote in New Brunswick to $2.54 in Ontario. Election BC officials described Ontario annual allowance, Mr. Speaker, as being most like that of BC we are putting together today. It should be noted, Mr. Speaker, that the Ontario Legislative Assembly recently adopted legislation to extend the provincial annual allowance at a rate of $2.54 per vote until 2024 and maintain eligible criteria which mirror those in British Columbia. So, Mr. Speaker, most other jurisdictions with annual allowance provide annual adjustments as well to per vote amount to reflect changes in the consumer price index. So there are some important questions, Mr. Speaker, people ask when we talk about the annual allowance to political parties. Question like, what is the eligibility criteria to receive the per vote allowance? To receive this funding, Mr. Speaker, a party must have received at least 2% of the total valid vote cast in all electoral districts, or 5% of the total valid vote in districts where the party had candidates in the most recent provincial election. At present, Mr. Speaker, as members said earlier, there are 5 political parties eligible to receive funding as per the formula today, including the BC Green Party, the BC Liberal Party, the BC NDP, the BC Conservative Party, and the Rural BC Party, Mr. Speaker. The other question, Mr. Speaker, is the annual allowance was originally due to expire in 2022. Why are you now making it permanent? That's a good question. So these changes, Mr. Speaker, are being made at the unanimous recommendation of all party special committee. It's a unanimous recommendation by all party committee to review provisions of the Election Act following the public consultation in April and May 2021, which invited British Columbians to share their thoughts on whether political parties should receive an annual allowance, how much they should be, and how long it should be paid. The third question, Mr. Speaker, is why should taxpayers subsidize BC political parties? That's also a question people ask. The previous model, Mr. Speaker, of big money donations benefited parties with wealthiest supporters. Therefore, competitive elections are good for democracy. It strengthens our democracy, Mr. Speaker. Public financing for political parties help give people the confidence that political parties are working for the people, not for political donors. It helps ensure that parties focus on the issues that matters to most British Columbians, working to earn every vote. Therefore, I would like to conclude by saying, Mr. Speaker, that I fully support the Election Amendment Act 2021 because the per vote allowance, Mr. Speaker, levels the playing field for political parties and keep the influence of big money out of politics. That a modest vote allowance, Mr. Speaker, is good investment in a strong and fair voting system. And by allowing increases with inflation, Mr. Speaker, this system provides all parties with a predictable and dependable funding. So we can keep big money out of politics. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, I fully support this bill because I think this is a good bill for the people of British Columbia. This is a good bill for democracy, to strengthen our democracy, and this comes from a unanimous report from all party committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Member. Minister of State for Lands and Natural Resource Operations.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's a pleasure to join with my colleagues today in talking about Bill 27, a relatively small act compared to many bills that are introduced in this place, but I would suggest that its consequences are much larger than the few pages and the few amendments that exist within this piece of legislation, because bills like this, changes like this, that our government, this legislature is making to the way democracy exists in British Columbia, has far-reaching effects. And I, along with many others, would argue that those effects are overwhelmingly positive. Now, for a place that I represent, northwestern British Columbia, and Stikine, the largest and one of the more remote ridings, many small communities, not necessarily a lot of wealthy and well-connected people to this place, the powers of this place, and yet they need voices and representation that can do the job on their behalf as well as any other British Columbia, regardless of their income, their political connection, their family, etc. So for rural and remote British Columbians, for people who don't have a lot of money, middle income, low income, people just struggling to get by, they need to have that faith that is oftentimes shaken, if not outright broken, that when we send someone to the legislature, when we send someone to town council, we send someone to parliament, that they're working and speaking on our behalves. And one of the things that comes into that question for many voters is money. The question of who's paying for campaigns and the signs and the door knocking and all of the rest, and is there any link in the contributions that people make into corrupting the system? And I use that word very specifically because it's such a dangerous element in our politics, is the question of money, the question of equity, access, not just for the wealthy and well-connected, who, in my experience, always find a way to take care of their interests and needs, but for the vast majority of British Columbians that we hope to serve each and every day. It is important, and it has been underlined, that this bill is coming forward with all-party contribution and all-party support, not necessarily a common thing, especially when talking about things like campaign finance reform and elections, which can be very, by its nature, divisive. This bill has been able to achieve, I believe, support from all of the represented parties in this place, and that is a good thing because it beats back that energy of cynicism, those thoughts of conspiracy that we so often see if you ever read the comments on social media, which you should not do as a general rule, Mr. Speaker. It's an unfortunate state of affairs that we live in today, that you know, the great potential of unification that social media could have. I'm looking at the health minister right now in particular. I encourage him generally not to read the comments because it's a place in which oftentimes legitimate concerns get swirled up into the more conspiratorial end of things. And when talking about who politicians work for, who we represent, sometimes you see that cynicism come through in letters to the editor for those of a more traditional bent, but also in the comment section on any social media post that you may put up. That in this place, we understand, those of us that come from rural BC, there's sometimes there is an outnumbering between the rural and urban votes that are cast in this province, the representation that comes forward in this place. We understand that fully, that the urban parts of this province have always been larger and are growing, in fact, faster still. And that the ability for us to understand that the connection back to money, the connection back to those in our society who have a great deal of money, not having outsized, even more outsized influence in what happens in British Columbia, and this bill deals with that. Many of my colleagues have touched on the basic mechanics of the bill, which are very important, in terms of a logical and sequential step to making sure that big money stays out of politics. That's what our government committed to, based on some pretty, what I would call telling and dangerous experiences of what it was like in British Columbia prior to the changes that we made. It's been cited, it wasn't just the New York Times, it was many commentators across this country and around the world, when looking at the rules, or if I could say lack of rules, that guided donations, political donations in British Columbia, that it was legal under previous governments for numbered companies, offshore donations to arrive in this province, disclosed somewhat. It was the experience of a previous premier who went to Calgary, and in just one dinner at the Petroleum Club, a former BC Liberal premier was able to raise $1 million in a night. What? $1 million from a neighboring province, from one sector in particular, at the Petroleum Club, while we were debating many important energy issues that were going on. And there's a connection of people wondering, how does that work? How do you raise $1 million in a neighboring province from one particular sector? Do you have to be nice? Is that enough? Do you have to consider policies? Do you have to consider the laws that are coming? And that's where the trust starts to break. That's where people start to say, well, the person I sent to the legislature, maybe their voice is being overridden, that my influence as a single individual voter and my family's influence is diminished somewhat when there is just simply no limits whatsoever to those who have money being able to drop $1 million in an evening to support one candidate or another. And I spent a fair amount of time in Washington, D.C., south of the border. And there, of course, they've had all the way up to the Supreme Court cases where money has been equated with voice and rights, and it's a most unfortunate decision, but that's their jurisdiction. But it's informative and instructive for us within our rules and our laws that when we as a government ban big money out of our politics, what does it look like when big money is in politics? And for anyone to stroll the halls of power in Washington and bump into who you bump into, pharmaceuticals, energy, private health insurers, gun lobbies somewhat, not so much for money, but for other things. But certain folks walk those halls of power on a consistent basis, and they're just not walking, Mr. Speaker, they're talking, and they're influencing, and they're able to either make commitments and promises of extraordinary amounts of money to our counterparts south of the border, but also the withholding of that money for future elections. And there is an equation that is not perfect, but exists within Western democracies, that those that tend to raise the most have a much better chance of being successful at the polls, because they can simply pay for more advertising, they can hire people to knock on doors, they can do all of those things that money enables in an election. And watching that influence happen in an extreme, in an almost obscene way, as it was taking place, I would argue, in our province for far too many years, and in other jurisdictions like in the US, one doesn't have to be a genius to know that there's going to be some cause and effect. If there are simply no limits, there are no rules, there's no understanding that the influence of money will play on our politics, then they say money in politics is like water on the sidewalk. It's going to find its way through all the little cracks and the little nooks and crannies that you leave, unless you seal it. Unless you say this is no longer acceptable. So we capped donations, but I think at a reasonable rate that most working people can imagine that amount of money. And we also just outright banned donations. And then the third piece of it, I would argue, there's probably more pieces that the minister can speak to, was ensuring that parties had sufficient money to exercise the democratic process and run campaigns to some sufficient level. So the starting at $2.50 per vote is now going to be reduced down to $1.75 and then connected to inflation. A reasonable amount. Not in my jurisdiction anyways. You can't get a cup of coffee anymore for $1.75. I don't know, I'm looking at the health minister, definitely not in his riding is coffee going for $1.75 anymore. But the idea of that being in a reasonable amount, the exercising right, and I've actually done a fair amount of campaigning outside of my jurisdiction, and there are times when people will say, I know candidate X isn't winning. They traditionally get 5 or 10% of the vote. And when we had this federally, this was in place for a small amount of time. But I know my vote's going to mean something important to them and their ability to represent my views, even though they may not represent me as a riding. Electoral reform is another issue we'll talk about another day maybe. But the effective voice and the connection back to effective voice, and that we all go into that what I consider a sacred place, the ballot box, and our ability to put a tick beside the name that we think will best represent our hopes and our dreams, and the dreams and hopes of our families and our communities, is a place that we should jealously guard. That power, that connection to citizen power in that moment, where the advertising doesn't matter, all the try to influence and the spin doctors no longer have effect, where that person, that voter, can sit there and exercise their right. And I took my kids, who are now 11, into the ballot box with me. Well, it was a voting station, it wasn't a box, you know, how it works, to see that, to just demystify, in fact, the process. Because I think for a lot of young British Columbians, a lot of young Canadians, they don't get into that part, and we know for practice that when we get young people to vote early, they'll much more likely vote the rest of their lives. And the reason that's important is because when people vote, they much more likely pay attention. And when people pay attention to what's going on in their worlds, they hold us more to account. When cynicism overrides the system, when people no longer feel connected to the folks that they send to this place, they stop paying attention. And bad things happen. We know sunlight is the best disinfectant. It's talked about far too much. So I'm conscious of the time and eager to hear some of the perhaps closing remarks from the minister, that there were hard lessons learned, Mr. Speaker, in this province when there were no rules, when it was simply sometimes elections to the highest bidder, and that caused serious and significant problems, not only in the minds and the views of voters and how much they could trust their connection to their elected representatives. I think it made for very bad policy from time to time when it's big condo developers and significant resource sectors that are able to drop, in some cases, and we have all the examples here. I don't want to raise them because I don't want to hurt the feelings of any of my colleagues across the way who are understandably somewhat sensitive to some of the past records of fundraising shenanigans that took place in which millions and millions of dollars were showered down upon their party. But I'm sure there was never a promise made. That I know, as we can hear, Mr. Speaker, sensitivities remain, and it's okay. I don't know if they doth protest too much, but it's probably something to that effect.
Just one moment. We'll let the minister finish, please. Thank you. Go
ahead.
I'll
I'll finish on a positive note for both my friends on this side of the aisle and across the way, that we understand that there are things that ought to unify us. And one of those things is the fairness of our election, the fairness of the vote, the free vote of citizens that we seek to represent. We do our best. That connection must be maintained and sustained. It can't be left to just the vagaries of the market. It has to be something in which the public conscience of good governance implores us to pass legislation like this that can then rebuild or establish the trust that has sometimes been eroded between us and the people that we seek to represent. I am proud to support this legislation and look forward to even more excellent legislation from the minister. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Seeing no further members, Minister would like to close the debate.
Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker. And I would adopt the conclusion of the Minister of State for Lands and Natural Resource Operations, the positive note he finished on about the importance of this legislation for democracy. And I appreciate very much his remarks, as well as the remarks of my colleagues, the member for Langley, Minister of State for Infrastructure, and all members who spoke to this. And I'd also like to make special note that I was paying attention and listening to the spokesperson for the opposition on this, the member for Abbotsford West, and I continue to appreciate his willingness both to engage with the subject matter of the bill, but also to lay out which areas he will be canvassing in committee stage. And rest assured, it is useful, I am sure, and make certain that staff are aware of his remarks. And we're better prepared, and the debate is better at committee stage for it, so I'm grateful for that. Mr. Speaker, I move the bill be referred to a committee of the whole House to be considered at the next... Oh, pardon me. Let me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's move second reading. With that, Honourable Speaker, I move second reading of the bill.
Members, the question of second reading of Bill 27. Those in favour, please indicate aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Motion carried. Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Now I move that the bill be referred to a committee of the whole House for consideration at the next sitting after today.
Members, you've heard the question. Those in favour indicate aye. Aye. Those opposed, nay. Motion carried. Government House Leader.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. Noting the hour, I move the House to now adjourn.
Members, you've heard the motion. Those in favour indicate aye. Those opposed, nay. This House is adjourned until 1:30 this afternoon.